everyone. Welcome to today's Summit, Best Practices for Enterprise VDI and End User Computing. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine and Virtualization and Cloud Review, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, enterprise cloud platform provider Nutanix, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief in the Converge 360 group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the first of 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, I need to go over a couple of housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our very best to get to all of them. Our sponsor has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. As you leave the summit today, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. Please take a moment to share your honest opinions. Our team reads every comment, and they help to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a DJI 2S foldable drone featuring a 1-inch CMOS sensor, powerful autonomous functions, and a compact body weighing less than 600 grams. It's an all-in-one aerial powerhouse for recording your world in stunning detail, but you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, VDI and EUC Best Practices in the New Remote Landscape. For this session, we've called on senior analyst and writer Tom Fenton. Tom has a wealth of hands-on IT experience in a variety of technologies, which he earned during his 25-plus year career. He worked at VMware in both staff and senior level positions, and he wrote the first training course for Horizon, VMware's virtual desktop product. He later served as senior validation engineer with the I always pronounce this wrong, with the Taneha Group, sorry, Tom, where he headed the validation service lab and was instrumental in starting its vSphere virtual volumes practice. His focus over the past 15 years has been on virtualization and storage, and he is a frequent contributor to Virtualization and Cloud Review and StorageReview.com. He is one of our most popular presenters. Take it away, Tom.
Hey, well, thank you for that nice introduction, John. And I got to give John props. He does an excellent podcast. So, John, what's the name of that podcast, and when can we expect the next edition of it?
As you put the pressure on me, it's the WatersWorks podcast, and the next one will be coming up later this month.
Oh, fantastic. I always enjoyed listening to those. So I am Tom Fenton. I spend a lot of time with VDI, Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, and Virtualization. I do live in the Pacific Northwest, beautiful day up here. We're enjoying end of ski season and going to start motorcycle season here shortly. So with that out of the way, let's kind of dig in here. So in this presentation, to cover the widest possible audience, I'm going to be going over best practices at a very high level. I'm not going to be digging into any particular product or technology. And I'm going to cover the entire stack, from the virtual machines running on the infrastructure to the clients in which they're displayed and all the connectivity in between. So it's going to be kind of high level, covering a lot of ground here. Let's go back. 3 years ago, before the pandemic, if someone would have asked me when will remote workforce be kind of enabled, I would have said maybe 5, probably 10 years before we really have a majority of the white-collar workers working remotely. But then the pandemic hit and everything changed. Now we're seeing, a huge swath of white-collar workers working remotely. People are enjoying it. Companies are enjoying it. But with this surge of remote working, we really need to use our resources to their full potential. We simply don't have the resources, whether it be hardware, software, and probably most importantly, manpower, to maintain this new infrastructure, this VDI infrastructure in a suboptimal manner. We don't have the resources just to throw at the problem we're seeing. And even if we could find employees to fill openings and deploy and support these remote workers, it would still take, months, if not years, to bring them up to speed and give them the tribal knowledge that they need to support this infrastructure. So hopefully in this presentation, you're going to be able to leverage some of the information that I've learned over the past 20 years to make sure you're doing the right things at the right time to the right people. We need to make sure we're using the right hardware, using it in the right way, and the right software, things like that. We really need to leverage this information to make sure that we're doing the right things. So as I go through this presentation, if you could keep just a couple things in mind, how can I deliver an outstanding employee experience to my users, regardless if they're remote or if they're local? And how can I monitor and observe the workers' digital environment to correct issues that affect them, or maybe prioritize incidents that are having the biggest impact on them to make sure that they do have that good end-user experience? Something I like to do before the presentations is I go out into the news and see what's kind of happening. And, remote worker is such a big news story that it was real easy to find the latest news stories. And one of the good things is that remote working really hasn't affected performance. Depending on the study, it has, improved employee performance, or maybe just made it slightly less productive. So that's the good news. And, and we're also seeing people are enjoying working remotely. We have this huge swath of the population that says, yeah, this is where I want to be. I want to be decoupled from the geographical location of my worker. I don't want to have to live where I work. I want to live, near my family. I live in the rural area. I enjoy that. I enjoy that lifestyle. And, to get the kind of work that I want, I used to have to go work in Palo Alto in the valley. And so we have this layer of distraction from workers to the workplace now, which is fantastic. And you just see all these studies saying people, yeah, I want to live where I want to live. And companies are embracing this. Airbnb, this is an article from 2 weeks ago. NPR did this nice story on how Airbnb will let its employees live and work anywhere. And as a bonus, some companies say, yeah, you can work where you want, but we're going to decrease your salary. But Airbnb, to their credit, said, you know what, we're paying for the workers. So regardless of where you work, you're still going to get the same salary. So this is just a huge boon. And as a follow-on to this, Airbnb, after they made this announcement, the people searching for jobs at Airbnb just went through the roof. And the CEO came out and said, you know what, why are we doing this? Why are we letting people work remotely? He says, because we want the best talent. We want people who can complete the tasks, regardless of where we live. So it really kind of is a neat thing. So this allows companies to recruit from a larger talent pool beyond, where the office is located. And a quote I said here is, and by recruiting from a diverse set of communities, we've become a more diverse company. That's what the Airbnb president said. So I think the whole point of these last two slides is, yes, remote workers, we are doing it, we're doing it well, and employees like it and companies like it. So let's dive in a little bit deeper. And one of the technologies that empower these remote workers is VDI, Virtual Desktop Infrastructure. Before I start digging into the details and talking about best practice, I just want to kind of do some level setting here and describe VDI and the parlance that we use when we're talking about it. If you're familiar with VDI, I apologize. This is a highly simplified view of VDI, and when I go through this presentation, my examples will be highly simplified as well. So I was really in a unique position when VDI first came out. I was working for VMware when they first released Horizon. Actually, it was called VDM at the time. And to be honest, I didn't get it. Why would anyone want to use a virtual machine, a virtual desktop, rather than a physical machine? But as I began to dive into the technology and work with the engineers who developed it, I began to understand its power and the attraction that it had. And now VDI is, a major product line for many companies. So in its most basic form, this is what this slide is showing. VDI is composed of virtual desktops running on some type of infrastructure, whether it be on-premise or in the cloud. And then on the right, users access it using a VDI client. It could be a tablet, a thin client, a client, a laptop. Doesn't really matter to access these virtual machines running securely in a data center. And they, of course, do this over the network. And then we have something called a connection server, connection broker. And what it does, it authenticates the users, says, yes, this user, is allowed or entitled to these virtual resources. So that's the simplest explanation of VDI that I could come up with. When we first started selling VDI, we pitched it as a cost savings. We had these fantastic calculators that could show you how much money you're going to save if you implement VDI. But the reality was the calculators were a little bit fuzzy with their math. Took a lot of, kind of big leaps of faith to get there. And to be sure, if you had a call center running, 24 hours a day, it made a lot of sense to run virtual desktops. Each shift would come in, they get their own virtual desktop. You only had to have a thin client on the desktop and blah, blah, blah. It really did make sense. But there are only so many call centers in the world. I mean, you have to remember at that time also, hardware was a lot more expensive than it is now. I mean, right now we have the systems. I mean, back then, 20 years ago, you had an 8-core system with maybe 128 gigs of RAM. That was kind of the industrial standard. Now, we have systems, dual proc systems with 32 cores each, so 64 cores in a server. About a terabyte of RAM and you could host, 200 to 300 users on it. You can even throw GPUs in the servers if you need to. So the cost savings now is considerably more than it was back in the day. But also around this time, we also had some security issues. People were taking their laptops, leaving them in a diner. USA Today, you'd open the front page, 10,000 social security numbers, personal information lost. And so by using VDI, we store all that information, not on the laptop. We store it in the data center where it's secure and where we can control the access to it. And so that was kind of what we sold on, on security basis. But then a few years later, we had a hurricane that kind of took out New York City. People couldn't get into their office buildings. You have to remember this was 15, 20 years ago when we didn't really have the mindset that people needed their PCs in order to do their tasks. We still sent memos by an office envelope and you signed off on them. So we didn't have this mindset until this hurricane came and kind of prevented people from going into the office. So we came up with this great business continuity story for VDI. Regardless of where you're working from, where you're located at, you can still access your desktop. And then there's the manageability portion, and this is huge. With VDI, you have one central gold image that you can push down rather quickly. You can update it, push it down to all your users. You don't have to worry about, is the user PC at his home or wherever, things like that. So it really made manageability real easy. And when users had an issue, you could just bring up their desktop and take a look at it. In some cases, it's just so far gone, so in such a mess that you can just re-provision it with just a single click. Everything is done in software. You didn't have to go out and pull the hard drive and clean it up that way. And then another benefit of VDI that really hit home with me during the pandemic when I was talking to the M&E guys, media entertainment guys, is data locality. During the pandemic, we had 2 weeks to kind of clear out of the offices and work remotely. And some of those big M&E firms said, okay, we're just going to send these workstations home with the users, and they can, create that great digital content that we enjoy, from their home. But what they didn't take into account is how are they going to access the data? I mean, these movies, this content, can take, terabytes of data. And do you really want that data sitting at someone's home unprotected? Security issues, films getting leaked, things like that. So data locality also was an issue that VDI helps resolve, because your storage is really close to the compute as well. So that's what VDI is and why it matters, and some of the benefits that people get from it and why they implement it. So let's start diving in a little bit deeper into it, and let's talk about the platform that these virtual desktops and these applications run on. Right now, you can either run it on-premise or in the cloud. And by the way, if you do have one of these workstations, you can also, attach it to a VDI environment as well. And the physical workstation will stay within the data center, but people will be able to access it from, outside from their home or wherever they might be working from it. Let's go back a few years and talk about what VDI looked like in the early days. We had something called composed infrastructure. Composed infrastructure, you basically have the servers and you have the storage. The storage tends to be in large storage arrays. These were big, expensive storage arrays. We needed these big, expensive storage arrays, mostly due to the IOPS. How many input outputs they can do per second. We had to RAID a bunch of hard disks, spinning rust, if you will, because that's all we had in the early days. So you had to RAID a bunch of them together to get the IOPS that we needed for it. Storage arrays, like I said, tend to be big, expensive, monolithic devices that you bought a capacity that you're going to think that you're going to need in 2 years, and then you slowly consume the capacity over time. So you have a lot of unused capacity while that slowly gets consumed over time. So, maybe not the best use of your resources. And another issue with this type of infrastructure is that you have the people managing the compute resources, the VMs, the virtual desktops, things like that. And then you had another group managing the storage. And these storage was expensive. It was a commodity that they couldn't just dole out. So to get storage, you had to go, hat in hand, asking for more storage. And the storage people might give it to you, but you're just going through a couple different layers of management to get it, and that kind of put a lot of friction in the process when we were deploying new virtual desktops. Fortunately, about this time, we came up with a new architecture called hyperconverged infrastructure. I was working for a company called Tenacia at the time that actually coined the term hyperconverged infrastructure. And with hyperconverged infrastructure, you can take the local storage on a bunch of different servers and create a pool of storage that any of the servers or nodes in that cluster could use. There was a few technology advancements that really made this possible. Probably the biggest one is, SSD drives, where a HDD drive might be able to kick out, 30 IOPS. An SSD could kick out 300 IOPS. And so you have the same capacity of IOPS in a local server that you would in an array. And the other thing that made this possible is the networking. Networks got faster, the bandwidth increased, so it wasn't a big deal to transfer data from a storage on one server to the compute on the other. So a bunch of different technologies like that. And actually, CPU companies like Intel, people who made the processors, they put some enhancements in their CPUs to enable this technology as well. So back in 2012, we came up with this hyper-converged infrastructure, and it really was a game changer. And the killer app for this hyper-converged infrastructure was VDI. And it made architecting VDI so much easier because you had a good idea of how many virtual desktops a node would support. Maybe it'd support 75 virtual desktops. So when you knew you were going to get 150 new users in, you could just add 2 more nodes. It made it real easy for the architectural side of it. But one of the biggest benefits, I think, was we got rid of this silo of management. Now the person who managed the compute could also manage the storage and, dedicate the storage rather than having to go back to the storage people and try to get it. So HCI pretty much eliminated the silos, enabled centralized management of compute storage and the networking resources as well. So good stuff. The killer app for HCI really was VDI and kind of it kicked it off. So what should you look for with a HCI implementation? A couple different things. Not HCIs are equal, and Nutanix, the people who are sponsoring this presentation, is one of the premier HCI providers, so I'll use their examples as we go through. For example, Nutanix and some other vendors, they're real flexible on the software and hardware that they support. There's a couple different hypervisors out there. Some are free, low-cost hypervisors. Others are more expensive. The more expensive ones might offer a few features that the lower-cost ones don't, but you might not need those features. So you want that flexibility in the software and the hypervisor software. Also, hardware selection. Some HCI providers pretty much sell you the nodes. You don't have any discretion on where you're buying the hardware from. Others are wide open, have support a wide variety, Dell servers, Lenovo servers, what have you. They'll support it. So you get to keep with the hardware that you have in your existing data center. Management flexibility, like I said, the great thing about HCI is you have a central management pane that does the compute as well as the storage. And you also want flexibility in what you can run in them. Maybe you want to run some GPUs. Make sure the HCI solution you have allows you to put the GPUs in them. And GPUs are becoming so prevalent in desktops that it's almost a given that you're going to need those. Performance is always an issue. You need to make sure that, for example, the storage, are they using NVMe drives, are they using SSD drives to get that kind of performance that you need. Resilience is huge. What happens when a node goes down? Does it affect the other nodes in the center? What happens to the desktops that were on that node? Do they automatically get restarted on another node? Things like that. So resilience is huge on that. And then another thing you need to consider, a lot of people don't consider, is that when the node comes back on, how easy does it integrate back into the cluster? Cloud connectivity, the cloud is huge. We all know it. Some HCI solutions do allow you to connect to the cloud seamlessly, so you can use those resources as well. Monitoring manageability, it's great that you can do storage and compute from the same screen, but how well are those integrated? How easy is it to work? How intuitive is the interface to work with? Ecosystem. Some HCI vendors, have this great ecosystem. If you need backup, there's a bunch of different products that support your backup security, a bunch of different products there as well. And the one I put at the bottom is cost, because cost is a factor. But if you don't have these other things I'm talking about, then, cost really, it becomes less of a factor if you aren't getting the kind of product that you want. Let's talk about storage just a little bit. When you look at an HCI solution, look at usable capacity, not raw capacity. For example, if an HCI only supports mere RAID, you're going to cut your capacity, your raw capacity in half to get your usable capacity. But other HCI vendors do offer erasure coding, which can increase your usable capacity. They offer things like deduplication, which can also increase your usable capacity. So raw capacity is an indicator, but really what you're after is usable capacity. Quality of service features. Not all virtual desktops are the same. Some might need more consistent, higher performance, and you might have to sacrifice some other virtual desktops in order to get that. So quality of service, make sure they have quality of service features. Balancing capacities when a new virtual desktop starts, which nodes it's going to go to, how smart is it about selecting those. Another thing you need to consider is in a perfect world, you're going to add one server and it's going to have enough storage for the capacity that you're adding, but that's not always the case. Sometimes we get out of balance and we need to add just more storage to a HCI cluster. Some HCI solutions are going to charge you the same license fee regardless if it's just used for storage or not, and that can get kind of expensive. So I know Nutanix has storage-only nodes, and it's one way they can decrease the cost of HCI environment. Data gravity. This used to be an issue in the early days, and basically what data gravity does is, is the virtual machine running on the same storage, on the same server that the storage is located. In a lot of ways, we got away from this. It isn't as big a deal as it was when we first came out with this, because networks are so fast and we have so much network capacity, and we have 100, 400 gigabyte networks now. Some other things you should look for in HCI is it a turnkey deployment? Can you just roll it out and use it, or do you have to kind of assemble it yourself? That'll give you a faster time to value. You won't have to spend the month putting it together and then testing it, doing regression tests every time you change things. So it is nice to have that turnkey deployment and nodes that are proven to work. The increased capacity, you just simply add another node and automatically gets detected and added. So things like that. And by the way, I am seeing a few questions here, so I appreciate it. So the questions I'll either answer in real time. I might deflect until an appropriate time in the session to answer them, or then me and John will do a wrap up at the end of the session to answer any questions. A couple questions here. What is the overcommitment of resources? Oh, okay. So overcommitment of resources is when you create a virtual desktop with, say, 4 processors. You create 20 of those, which is 40 virtual CPUs, but you only have 32 physical CPUs in the system. So you overcommit resources, and that's fine because those CPUs aren't all going to be running at the same time. So it's overcommitment is fine. Another question. What's a noisy neighbor? Oh, a noisy neighbor is a term you may have heard. It's just when a VM or virtual desktop overconsumes resources and it prevents other VMs from using those resources. So it might be really chatty with the storage and preventing other people from getting into the storage. And that's why you need things like QoS. Another thing, Brian asks, is the storage hot, cold, or hybrid? Usually for the virtual desktops, it's hot when it's being used. Some HCIs do have tiered storage, so if the virtual desktop isn't being used frequently or is powered off, then it goes to cold storage. All right. And Brian, I'll get to that next question here in just a bit. Thank you for those questions. I really appreciate it. One of the interesting things that happened during the start of the pandemic is we couldn't buy hardware. We couldn't buy servers. There was a shortage of servers. So what a lot of people did is they went to cloud desktops, desktop as a service. And this way people got around the hardware shortage. They were able just to deploy their desktops in the cloud. So these desktops using cloud resources kind of neat because it allows you to use an OpEx model rather than a CapEx model. Let's go one more slide here. So what should you use? Should you use on-premise for your desktops, or should you use a cloud resources desktop as a service? So some things you should look for. There's some good and bad with these, some trade-offs between the on-premise and the cloud resources. Something you need to consider is geographically, where's the solution hosted? Some nations, some corporations say that the desktops have to be located within a certain country in order to meet their corporate governance goals. There's clouds all over the world, but they might not be necessarily in the country that you're running in, so that might disqualify it. Performance. You have to be sure that your DaaS solution, your cloud solution, meets the performance requirements of your users, including being able to use things like GPUs. Using GPUs with on-premise, pretty straightforward, pretty simple, but not all cloud services offer that. The cost. In some cases, cloud is cheaper, but in a lot of cases, if you've already paid for and depreciated the cost of your on-premise servers, then it isn't cheaper. It's if you've already amortized the cost of your on-premise equipment, it isn't necessarily cheaper. Or if you're running those desktops 7/24, it probably isn't cheaper to run those in the cloud than it is to run them locally. However, you have to include other costs like having people on site to maintain your on-premise equipment. The flexibility. One of the places where you can really see a huge cost savings when using cloud is if you have a bursty business. The classic example is a florist shop, right? They're just going to get slammed with orders during Mother's Day. And if they had to set up the additional desktops for the people taking the calls and things like that, it would be quite expensive to just have the equipment sitting there vacant for 11 months of the year just so they could do that burst activity. In that case, cloud is really an attractive option for that. Availability. With clouds, make sure they have a service level agreement that meets your requirements. Let's go. Another question there. We'll get to that one in just a second. The good thing is that a lot of VDI solutions, including Nutanix, is they offer a hybrid model. They support a hybrid model where you can use cloud resources as well as physical servers. That way you can choose the best of both worlds. Let's talk here. Best practices. Should you use cloud or on-premise? The advantage of and here I have on-premise just as HCI because it's so prevalent in the world today, in the VDI world. HCI, you're going to have a moderate CapEx. It's a lot better than using composed infrastructure because you can add new nodes as you require the capacity. You don't have to, forecast and buy hardware, 2 years in advance like you do with the storage arrays. So you have kind of a moderate CapEx model there. You purchase them for the near term. You can add new nodes as you need them, and you consume that moderately over time. You might add 2 more servers with 150 desktops. You might use that over a month or two, and then you bring in the next 2. So you don't have to by capacity for 1,000 new desktops. You can gradually add it as needed. DAS is nice because it's totally an OpEx model. You can pay-as-you-go model, purchase them as you used, and then consume it as needed. So it really has a nice model there. But I really am getting sold on this hybrid model that a lot of people are going to, because you can have CapEx for some of your desktops and then have OpEx for the others. If you do have a bursty infrastructure, you can just add those at Christmas time. You can add those extra users, extra desktops using cloud resources, and then keep the other on-premise. Or if you are seeing a huge expansion in growth, you can go ahead and provision those desktops in clouds and then bring those people back on-premise if that model works for you. And you can purchase the resources as needed, and you can consume them moderately. So, that hybrid model really is starting to be attractive for a lot of companies, a lot of people. So we talked a little bit about the back end, about the clients. Now let's talk about the clients. This is actually the only piece of hardware that most end users will see. It's what you connect to the virtual desktop with. And you can use mobile devices like tablets. You can use thin clients, thick clients. You can use laptops. If you have some old PCs, you can repurpose those into just pure VDI clients. But if you do have users that have a home laptop that they're willing to use for work, you can do something called a native client. And a native client is just an application that runs on your laptop or your desktop that provides a VDI client to it. So that's really attractive for a lot of remote workers. They just use their home system to access their VDI desktop. There's a huge variety of these. Oh, let me go back one. A huge variety of these. These can range from, inexpensive. The one in the middle is an ARM-based device. It's relatively inexpensive, about $150, to all-in-one devices where you have the VDI client built into the monitor itself, to high-performance ones. I just got done doing a review on this 3280, this Amulet Hotkey DX3280, and it's basically almost a workstation. It has 8 gig of RAM, has a Intel i7 core processor in it. It has a GPU with 4 monitors in it, with the support for 4 different 4K monitors in it. So you can get this wide variety of clients. If you have a task worker who's just doing one application, maybe 2 applications, that little ARM guy for $150 is a great way to go. But if you have people doing engineering or financials where you have 5 different screens on it, you're going to spend some money to get a nice client for them to access it. And I do see a question about clients. If using a thick client to start, is this like an RDP session then with full functionality of the PC still there? Yes. I think I talked about that, and yes, you can use the native client and actually have the PC functions still running on the laptop. But then maybe you have a financial application that you need secure, or a medical application that you need securely stored in the data center, and you can use a virtual desktop in it. Let's see. Another question from Brian. If data loss protection built into this with configurable settings. There are different ways people do data loss prevention, and the good thing about it is with a VDI environment versus using a local system is you can back up your data using enterprise-grade software in the data center rather than relying on the individual user to back up their data in their home location. I think that might be what you're getting at there. So match the client to the user. A bunch of different clients out there, whether it's a native client that you run as an application, a thick client is usually a repurposed PC that runs some bespoken software on it. It's usually Linux-based, but all it does is act like a VDI terminal. And of course, I'm getting just a little bit of feedback on the line here. All right. I think got that taken care of. Fantastic. So we have all these users. We need to make sure they have a great user experience. Nothing will kill a VDI implementation faster than someone having a subpar user experience. So you need to make sure that they have secure, that the virtual machine is right sized. There's some great monitoring software out there. One of the more interesting things that we've seen with people working remotely is security issues. People go home, they work from home or a coffee shop, and their Wi-Fi authentication isn't set up correctly. So there, again, is some software that will go out there and make sure that the endpoint, the VDI client attaching to the Wi-Fi router in homes are using the latest or the appropriate Wi-Fi authentication, and then it'll shut those nodes down if they aren't. I'm going to come back to that one in just a second. Another thing that'll kill a VDI implementation is log-on duration. If people have to wait, 2-3 minutes every time they log on, it'll just kill you. And so there are some scripts out there, some software. They'll go through and analyze all the things going on during the log-on process, and so you can figure out where they're having issues, and then you can go ahead and correct them. There's, like I said, there's scripts out there. There we go. So this is a geographical representation of all the processes that go on during the logon, and so you can find the process that is taking the most amount of time. You can see here it's a group policy that is causing the issue, so you can go in there and correct it if needed. Another thing that will kill one is the response time. That's the time it takes from you clicking an object to the time that you get a response back from it. And 3 years ago, Microsoft actually included the input delay metric, so you can monitor this. And so if people are complaining that things are just sluggish, you can actually go in and take a look at the response time. And that way, when you do make changes, you have quantifiable metrics to compare it to. And here's a monitoring solution that actually monitors this for a bunch of different users, all your VDI users, so you can see when they are having issues with it, and you can address those. So if people have to wait 1/10 of a second, they're usually okay with that. But when it gets to 1 second, they need some kind of feedback. And if it's going to be over 10 seconds, I mean, you've lost the user. You need to let them know it's going to be minutes before they might get a response from it. Like I said, one of the great things about VDI on the management platform is you can take a gold image and then replicate that down to all the virtual desktops, and these are called cloned virtual desktops. Makes management so easy. Because you can correct a problem in one image, and it'll automatically get flushed down to all the users themselves. Another thing you're going to want to make sure you do is optimize the OS for VDI. After you install it, there's some great OS optimization tools. VMware makes a great one. That goes through, gets rid of all the device drivers that it doesn't need, gets rid of all those startup processes that it doesn't need. So use an OS optimization tool on your desktops as well. You can actually increase guest density. That's the amount of virtual desktops that run on your hardware by just optimizing them. I've seen it, 10-15% higher guest density once the desktops are optimized. Published applications are fantastic. Published application just sends the application to the VDI client rather than the entire desktop. It does a couple things. First, a lot of these applications display better on mobile devices than trying to bring the entire desktop over. Uses less resources than trying to do an entire desktop, and it makes it more secure because people can't go around and fiddle with things on the desktop. They just get presented with a single application. So, publish applications if you can. However, not all applications are designed to be published and be in a multi-user role. So you need to make sure that the application does behave well when it does get published out. This is what published applications look like. Usually VDI connection server will spit out a list of the applications or desktops that are available for the users. So that comes from the connection server. Another thing you need to be aware of is unified communications in a virtual desktop. These can kill a virtual machine because they are very CPU intensive, network intensive. So here's a screenshot of the Zoom running on a virtual desktop. And you can see that it's using about 50% of the CPU capability of that virtual desktop. And like I said, these just can slam them. And with this remote working workforce, we all use them. So what do? VDI vendors have come out with something called multimedia redirection. And what this does is it takes the process that was running in the virtual machine and runs it on the client itself. So it uses the client's resources rather than the virtual machine resources. And this can also greatly affect your guest density, and you can increase the number of virtual machines that are running on a set amount of hardware. The scroll, the graph underneath here, the part on the left shows I'm monitoring the CPU on the client itself. So when you're not using MMR, the CPU isn't being used very much. But once we take that process and run it on the client, you can see it increases the CPU usage on the client itself for it. So definitely do that. Another thing it does is it decreases the networking because the networking goes directly out of the client to the other UC communication. Doesn't have to go all the way to the data center, to the virtual machine, back out. It short circuits that and it goes directly to the other VDI client. Networking, a few things you should be aware of is make sure these resources are available, that you can't access them. And so companies offer something called synthetic monitoring that you can use to monitor virtual desktops, publish applications, even SaaS applications. Something that you want to look for when you do buy a synthetic monitoring solution is make sure that you can. So the way most synthetic monitoring solutions work is they send out a test from a location to see if that resource is available. So make sure you can do that from a bunch of different geographical locations. And the reason I say this is I have a coworker who is having some problems with Office 365. They're located in Ireland. I didn't have any problems, and the synthetic monitoring solution they were using actually sends out these tests from a bunch of different locations. And sure enough, people in Europe and the Middle East were having issues where me in the West Coast of the U.S. wasn't having the issue at all. So if I was helping to try and diagnose the problem, I simply didn't see it. Home networking, we've also seen this as a issue. And so there's software out there that will go out and check the latency from your VDI client to your router, and make sure the latency there is good. Right now, you can see this is just a horrible 219 milliseconds of latency, but we never would have found that if we didn't have this monitoring solution that allows us to check from the client to the home router. Yep. There we go. Another thing people can do is they can use SD-WAN. What SD-WAN does is it gives you a bunch of different routes to go through if your main networking topology does go down. So example, if you're using broadband, it goes down. It might use 5G or MPLS to contact that. And you don't want to use this for everyone, just kind of those high value employees and high value desktops. Starlink, I had to throw this in. A cool technology. However, working remotely using Starlink, you probably aren't going to get really great performance. They have 100 megabits per second, and people have reported it goes down to like 15 megabits per second if a lot of people are using it. So Starlink, great idea, but it's just not there for remote desktops yet for the most part. So why have remote VDI implementations failed in the past? People don't roll it out in phases. Start small and grow as you become more accustomed with it. Got to mention I/O storms. In the early days, we just didn't have the IOPS on the storage to deliver a good experience for the end users. This has pretty much been removed now that we have the SSD drives and things like HCI. So I/O storms simply aren't the problem, but people might have this preconceived notion about I/O storms. And I/O storm is just when everyone boots up at the same time, it tends to use a lot of IOPS. So you need to make sure you have the capacity for that. Cost overruns. People would buy these big composed infrastructures, buy these big storage arrays, and not consume it. It became very expensive. HCI really reduces the risk of over provisioning hardware and cost overruns. So make sure you pick the correct VDI platform. We kind of covered a lot of this. Monitor your environment. Make sure those users are having a good experience. Make sure that it's holistic, monitors the entire stack from the virtual desktops to the clients. Make sure that it can do things like real-time monitoring. And then I have to throw this in, automate when you can. Nutanix has a great automation scheme, and they have one example where a desktop is short of memory, and so it automatically adds more memory to that desktop if it needs. So, automate where you can. Let's see. So, monitor the entire infrastructure and do self-healing, self-management if you can. So, kind of to wrap things up, gave you a lot of ideas for best practices, things you can do. You're going to have better security. Employees are going to have a better experience. Companies are going to enjoy it because it's going to lower their costs. They're going to get more virtual desktops on the infrastructure that they're running. It's going to be easier to manage. And by the way, a lot of these tips are on Virtualization and Cloud Review. I wrote a series of 7 articles, so if you want to review those, it is out there for you. So 3 questions, can you deliver an outstanding, secure employee experience to your users? Yes, you can using VDI. And can you monitor and observe your workers' environment? Make sure you have the tools in place to make sure everyone is having a good user experience. And then, automation is so important just because we lack the people to take care of all the issues. John, I think we've done there. We covered a lot of ground in 50 minutes here. Let's see.
You certainly did.
Let's see.
So we've got a couple minutes here. Shall we grab a couple of these questions here?
Let's go do that.
Let's remind people that you still have a couple minutes to put in some questions. Just add them to the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to them. Okay. So we've got one here from Greg. He's wondering, video playback was the big issue for us with VDI. Our end users would watch YouTube on the local PC and eventually not want to use VDI at all because they didn't want to switch between the local browser and the VDI interface. How is video playback, YouTube, performance on the $150 option?
$150 option I haven't tried it. I should. I've done some other low-cost VDI clients, and it worked out well. But the trick is, remember that MMR that I was talking about, that multimedia redirection? It also works for a YouTube and a browser content. So make sure you implement that, and that'll be a huge savings, because it not only will decode it there locally on your client, but it'll also bypass the network and go directly to YouTube rather than having to pass through the virtual machine. So look at using MMR with that, and I think you'll see a huge savings there.
Great, thank you. So Tom is wondering, what would be your recommendation if starting a new business offering VDI access? A little bit general, not sure. You have, I guess you could just pick a recommendation at this point.
Yeah, I recommend starting new. So the new business is going to use VDI, or are you going to offer VDI as a service from the business? Let's see. So, starting a new business. So VDI access, I think I'd definitely start out small. A lot of these solutions you can deploy in one or two nodes, get a few users on it, gain experience with it. Don't try to implement, 10,000 users at one swoop. You'll fail, to be honest with you. Start out small and grow with your users. But I think you'll find it's real easy to use. Couple different solutions there, just so easy to use. I think you'll have success with it.
Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Many thanks to Tom Fenton for a great session, and to our sponsor, Enterprise Cloud Platform provider Nutanix, for making it possible. Thanks, Tom.
Hey, thanks, John. Really appreciate it. Really enjoyed it.
See you again soon. Okay, guys, we're going to take a short break, but we'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session right around then. Top tips and best practices for securing VDI and EUC, led by cybersecurity expert Ian Thornton-Trump and moderated by my colleague David Rammel, who leads the editorial team at Virtualization and Cloud Review. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsors.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit, called Top Tips and Best Practices for Securing VDI and EUC. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and also thank Nutanix for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this event. Our speaker for this session is Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO at Cyjax. He is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience, including security. He served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch before joining the CF Military Police Reserves and retiring as a public affairs officer. After a year with the RCMP as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst/consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare. Ian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Oh, thanks so much, and it's always delightful to be here and talk about things. Hey, this one, I'll tell you, this was a tough one because there are a lot of marketing speak out there, and actually trying to dig into what end user computing is, which is sort of like the evolution of VDI, was a bit difficult, I got to say. I state for the record, at the beginning of this, when I started doing the research, I had no idea what they meant by end user computing. There's a lot of interesting documentation on this. Some people have written theses going back to 1978 on it. And I mean, I read, and finally, I think I can describe what the promised land is of VDI. And we can sort of like go through this presentation today with the understanding of, as these technologies become more and more present in our daily lives and fix issues that have cropped up, and you heard some great ones from Tom early on about, the issues around like video playback and applications suddenly causing grief in computing networks that are delivering either VDI. But to understand that, I think we have to take a step back and really talk about the experiences of sort of how we got to where we landed. And it starts here in a way of understanding what the new definition of end-user computing is, and how VDI almost sits underneath that, and that in order to get to VDI, you need a solution that is usually multifaceted. And there's a number of different pieces of this particular puzzle. And I would say that unless you are very skilled in the Microsoft world, all of what we're talking about today can be accomplished by tools, but it's immensely complex, this beast. And as Tom pointed out in his presentation, there has to be a baseline, if you will, of knowledge and understanding. And so my ideas right now are really around, if you're going to go and explore this route, if you're going to go down the road of VDI and then end-user computing, the architecture of your infrastructure, your SAN, your storage, how you're going to accomplish this, if it's going to be a hybrid model, these are immensely complex ways of delivering an end-user computing experience overall if you're trying to do it without a vendor. What I'm saying here is a vendor that has the majority of the moving parts and buttons sorted, your experience of trying to deliver this environment is going to be far more successful. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be into a perfect computing environment, because as you know, it appears that anything IT related is never perfect. There are always gotchas, and we're going to talk about this right now. So big time opportunities in this space. I mean, there's a lot of different vendors providing a lot of different solutions, some that have, I would say, the majority of it sorted, but in other cases, once you get beyond the hypervisor environment, there's a ton of other things that you need to do this properly. But it is a high growth opportunity space, no question about it. We've seen, probably driven a lot by the pandemic experience, an acceleration into this technology. But if you listen to what Tom had to say, all was not particularly well in the end-user computing world, especially when there were other either recreational programs that employees wanted to use, various websites that maybe the business value is somewhat questionable. So there is a whole other side of just managing the IT stack on top of the technology piece, and we're going to get at some of that threat model. As a classic example, VDI, remote desktop, we're going to talk a little bit about that and how it's not completely gone away, and there are some reasons for that, and we'll discuss. But also, very important to understand that from the current threat model, from the latest data that we have from CISA in the United States, infrastructure compromise and business email compromise are two of your biggest threats. And if you're great and have this VDI lockdown environment that you've managed, and you've gone to a vendor like our sponsor and they've really helped you out to get where you needed to go in terms of delivering this, it still won't prevent a business email compromise attack or fraudulent activity. So there's a big subset of security that it doesn't really matter what platform you're on per se. Social engineering attacks go anywhere they like. And again, it's not an excuse to not spend on security, and it's not an excuse to not spend on user awareness training. Okay, so VDI. So another way of suggesting and talking about VDI was back in the day, thin client experience, or the terminal that would connect. Now, I go back to the days of like AS400 and Xterm and all sorts of different protocols that we used back in the day to connect one computer to another computer in a multi-user environment. Now, back in the day, the multimedia demands, the applications that you would run, all of these things, especially on VAX systems, AS400s, and the early Microsoft client server environments that were absolutely horrific. I'm thinking about, the early stage of Citrix, where trying to print and get printing working was one of the biggest challenges within that client-hosted environment. So to look at where we are today in terms of VDI, it's like we have a client that accesses a virtual machine, the broker that directs the clients to the appropriate virtual machines, a virtualization server, and VMs that are used as the desktop. The attack surface remains the same in many ways. The technology, though, mitigates some of that attack surface, but vulnerability management is still a major part of a VDI infrastructure management. And although that is somewhat born in terms of like everything up to and including the hypervisor in a relationship with a cloud services provider, for instance, there is still a heck of a lot of work to do. And also, and I want to kind of pivot off Tom's point about cost overruns. This is expensive to do it properly, because one of your biggest challenges is really going to be around looking at the applications that run your business, providing the same, if not better, experience in the VDI environment than your users are using in the workstation sitting on a network experience. So there's a ton of work that still needs to occur within the environment. So the majority of spaces now in VDI, some applications are very comfortable working in VDI. There are other applications that you need to run locally or over our favorite guy, remote desktop services, which is still going to be used in a lot of cases for administrative functions within the organization, right? So again, we have the same attack surface of we have apps installed on the remote PC, or in the case of VDI, we have those applications either published or as part of the desktop that is presented to the customer. We will look at kind of those two different attack surfaces. Access files and network resources, right, on whatever remote PC, if it's a terminal server, or as we call them now, remote desktop server, we access network resources on. And of course, the big one for me, which is difficult, is leaving the apps open when you turn off the client. And this is a huge challenge with anything that creates a persistent session on another server. So let's go back to that. In the VDI environment, there are two types of VDIs, right? There's a persistent, non-persistent. I have a slide on that. We'll talk about why that's important coming up to make the determination of where you're going with it. But when you look at those two environments and those key things that the VDI, the workstation, the remote desktop services are performing, we have an attack surface that is fairly easy to enumerate. And I want to put up this slide, and I hope you folks can see this particular slide, because it speaks to the differences between remote desktop services and VDI. So if we look at a virtual kind of environment that we've created for our users, we see the evolution from RDS, which was basically included, and you bought CALs and all these kind of fancy things in order to connect up your users. And there was a lot of value in RDS, but there were huge limitations, right? So as an example, RDS is a common environment, right? It does not create a virtual machine running on the infrastructure for each user, right? VDI is great because if you install an application on your golden image or you publish an application, it becomes available to everyone on that particular image that they're running if you like. So it's very simple to do. I'm going to stop you right there and say, though, there is a lot of requirements for testing in the VDI environment because not, as Tom said, not all applications are really comfortable working within that VDI environment. And for a number of different performance things that we can get into. But vulnerability management on a terminal server is a nightmare. It's a nightmare because people leave the sessions aren't closed out, the app is open. So you go to try and patch something like Microsoft Word in a terminal server environment and bring it update, and it's a mess, right? In a lot of cases, you have to literally clear all the sessions, patch the application, which is, of course, going to be an inconvenience to your users, yeah. And VDI, the patch is a one-time thing on the golden image that you're using or the base image that you're using for your virtual desktop. So again, a huge requirement there for vulnerability management made a lot easier with VDI, right? And again, in remote desktops, I don't recommend doing this, but you can have with a remote desktop session within a remote desktop session, which is all kinds of fun. Remote desktop servers have a disadvantage in that it is possible to move laterally within the remote desktop server by scarfing up rights on it. So, for instance, on running a tool that a malicious actor will use, like Mimkatz, on a terminal server is like the holy grail because you get all of the user IDs and passwords out of that terminal server, as opposed to in a VDI environment, there might be one or no administrative level privileges within that VDI environment if the team has worked really hard to secure that VDI environment, right? There is, again, in VDI, you're talking about a fairly big budget. No one goes into this VDI essentially, with the eyes wide on this one, because the costs of getting those applications or your infrastructure ready to support a VDI could be a fairly high cost. And this is why, for all of this, this is like lab work. This is like expert advice from vendors. A company like any that is working here, including our sponsor, has dealt with a lot of legacy applications being migrated into a VDI environment. So that's probably where the expertise lies. And then also, when you're looking at your applications that you support and you have valid vendor support, do an inventory with those applications, a risk-based inventory, and talk to those vendors and say, we're thinking of doing a virtual desktop environment. Do you have some best practices? Do you have some tips? Do you have recommendations on what we need, right? Again, backups are easy, and managing the infrastructure is easy in the VDI world. I say easy, but that's dependent on the complexity. And of course, resource management in RDS, we solve that by just giving it more disk, more CPU, and hoping that the users behave in that environment. So, as a sort of graphic representation of this, here we have AutoCAD 2020. And I will say, you might be able to even talk about Adobe Creative Cloud here as well. But AutoCAD is a great example of an application that is going to require massive VDI resources and is absolutely a nightmare to do on a terminal server environment, right? So again, when you think about the apps that you have in your environment and how you're going to manage those applications, there's a cost-benefit analysis in terms of IT cycles that you really have to get into. And I do know for a fact that we're still in the world of the RDP hackenings on port 3389. And don't think for a moment that just changing the port makes your threat landscape go away. Security by obscurity is ridiculous, and we all know that, and it doesn't work. So let me show you, even though you've done your VDI, there are a lot of things, perhaps sensitive things, perhaps bastion hosts that are available within the network environment that guard an OT environment, right? So the idea being is there's a bastion host out there, you remote desktop from whatever, workstation, laptop, phone, doesn't matter, but you're now getting into a bastion host in order to get at the rest of the infrastructure. That's still, to this very day, being done over 3389. And let's talk about that external RDP thing. And we'll talk about how VDI solves some, but not all of this problem. So this was the typical way remote desktop was deployed, right? You had, if you weren't insane, you had a VPN infrastructure in front of the remote desktop. Now, some folks decide that what's cool is having remote desktop open to the entire internet. That's a terrible idea for a number of reasons. But let's just assume that the old way was VPNs. VPN into the infrastructure. You got all sorts of problems with VPNs, again, from a management perspective, patching and updating. I mean, there was just another Pulse Secure VPN vulnerability. Every sort of major VPN company has had, it seems to have had a series of different vulnerabilities. So you have a hardware appliance, possibly several of them, that you have to invest in. You have to invest in vulnerability management in downtime, right? Then we have the service itself. We all know the fun that was out there with a bunch of exploits for remote desktop. And we have, we're reliant on our password policies. And unfortunately, that was not rigorous enough to prevent brute force attacks, which of course would lead you to be pwned either by exploitation of the VPN device, exploitation of the actual remote desktop server, and then potentially via a brute force attack or a vulnerability, and then that's how you get Maze ransomware. Okay? Now, this was also a major problem in that you could conduct very easily a denial of service attack on that remote desktop server. Because before Microsoft got a very fancy thing, which they call NLA, or network layer access controls on the remote desktop server, you could just be brute forcing or doing denial of service attacks on the actual remote desktop server itself. And this is why, again, you had that compensating VPN technology to try and prevent, having remote desktop open to the world. The problem, and there are a few problems that manifested with the movement to NLA, right? And I seriously suggest that you look at this security issue very carefully, because there are some very positive NLA results, but there are limitations to it. And so, again, this is sort of the first stop of the journey that we went through to the VDI environment, which we're going to talk about. So again, today in a secure network, we usually have either a threat blocker type of appliance on the outside, a secure web gateway that provides that multi-factor single sign-on capability to get at the remote desktop. I said it could be on a different port, whatever floats your boat, but 3389, there's no real point in changing that port because the idea of the secure web gateway is to not expose the service directly to the network, and so everything from the front end looks like it's 443, right? And then, of course, we would deploy our technologies on that box, that remote desktop server, be it EDR, XDR, SOAR, whatever type of acronym you want to deploy. And again, one of the other solutions that was looked at is VPN client to client through cloud point of presence. This is a more innovative technology on protecting remote desktop boxes in that you have to have a client on the target box, you have to have a client on your connecting box, and they actually reach out to one domain. And it's a cloud point of presence, and all of your security happens in the cloud with this VPN connection. It's pretty slick. There's a number of vendors out there that do this. But again, it doesn't solve all of our problems in terms of an attack surface either. So one of the things that can happen no matter what is attacks on the vulnerabilities on that particular virtual desktop environment, right? Phishing email is a reality. Phish comes in, manages to get through your defenses or whatever the place is. User clicks on it in a virtual environment. Again, so the virtual session can be then hijacked by bad guys. So we still have the same issues with exposure to the internet through the web browser or the email client primarily. So within that environment, that VDI environment, there's still a requirement to keep things updated, such as the web browser, if you're delivering applications, web applications over that. And on the email client side, again, you're going to make sure that that's patched and up to date if they're using the Office 365 Outlook app, or you're going to, for instance, have them log into Office 365 remotely via the web client, which isn't a great experience for people handling large volumes of email, which is pretty much everything in your organization. If that session falls to the bad guys, absent any other controls that you might have built in, you still have access to files and network resources on the remote PC, the remote desktop, the VDI. So keep that in mind, is that there's still work that needs to be done. There's still segmentation and micro-segmentation that you need. And then, of course, the issues of applications that leave sessions open on resources that are exposed to the internet, but also are exposed internally. And I'm talking about SaaS applications where the client and server relationship is poorly coded, and session cookies can be hijacked and then authenticated to that surface. And this is why in SaaS environments, you must have multi-factor authentication and SSO. If you don't have those two things, I can steal the session cookie off of the environment if I get access to it by a phishing email, install my rat, install my Trojan in the virtual desk environment, and exfiltrate those cookies, which I can then use against the SaaS application absent the actual VDI environment, right? So the same attack can take place in either environment. And then, of course, you have your persistent VDI and non-persistent VDI. Non-persistent VDIs are essentially a way of snapshotting where the user was so that when the user comes back in, all of their apps are there again. But again, if all of your users have ability to customize their environment, you can have a big requirement for volume and a big requirement to manage that environment successfully. So I've included the reference to the Microsoft Docs when you're considering making remote desktop or VDI recommendations, and there's a lot of them, folks, a lot, on how to make this environment work, including things that you need to turn off. Otherwise, they can cause major issues and problems. So, I fell behind a little bit on my slide deck here, so we'll get to this now because I've finished that. All right. So now we're going to talk about the thing that VDI actually does solve. So when we think about zero trust, we are attempting to solve a problem that has persisted through computing since we had our first computers. And we call this new architecture zero trust. VDI goes a long way in managing that through basically visibility, like Tom talked about, automation and orchestration solutions. Now, you'll notice that I have this sort of color-coded. I'm going to say that VDI solves a problem with consistency and management of endpoint virtual environments or endpoints in general. I think if we're in a pure play VDI intention, then you get a huge green checkmark box because you're actually managing one or two or five environments that you present to your customers. So that is 100% accomplished, green light, brilliant, right? The next thing, though, is the data. And this one is a bit more difficult because the access to data and the ability to create local files can potentially be a problem. This can be managed, though, by strict controls that are put in, which, again, you can do in the Microsoft environment, but, man, is it complicated and difficult, right? So you kind of get it doesn't necessarily solve all of the data problems, especially in those SaaS applications or whatnot. It does, however, in the VDI environment where you're publishing applications or you're providing a common desktop with the business applications on it. Again, from application management perspective, you get a big green checkmark box there. But the problem comes in when you're now relying on third-party SaaS applications. You have to say those are out of scope in terms of management, right? Because you don't know what's going on with, the Oracle cloud environment that you're working in or the Adobe cloud environment or any of those cloud environments, right? And then in terms of infrastructure, I give these sort of a yellow, proceed with caution. Because, again, until you get to the point where your infrastructure is completely under your own management other than the service provider, right, you pretty much are going to run for quite some time both a traditional infrastructure and this virtual infrastructure until you can migrate all of your apps that you have in your environment over to the new virtual infrastructure that you have, right? And then finally, on the networking side, again, if your network is in-house, great. If your networking is provided by a third party, again, there's some things that are going to fall outside your ability control. Okay, all right. So we get to the question that everybody is asking. Is VDI the promised land? Well, as I said, it's a big step in that right direction to a zero trust framework. No question about it. But again, the attacks that your business is going to face day to day, virtual desktops are still vulnerable. And this is a requirement then to run something such as an EDR, but there is problems with EDR in terms of can be a large performance hit. When I was doing research for this, Carbon Black, for instance, seems to have looked at the VDI environment and has all sorts of crazy suggestions on what you need to do to configure their product to work. I assume that that's probably the same case for SentinelOne and others. This is because of the nature of EDR solutions or SIM solutions. So what the solution, oddly enough, is that Microsoft says, well, just run Defender on your virtual environment. Because it's designed to work properly in that environment. Well, it is and it isn't, right? But again, you still have vulnerability management to do, and there are still 0 days that can attack everything from your hypervisor on up, right? And again, lateral movement by a threat actor that's compromised a virtual desktop and has managed to get remote access to it one way or the other can still perform lateral movement and as we call it, LOTL, living off the land. If, again, that image that is being presented hasn't had a lot of engineering cycles into it to make it solid and locked down as per all of the Microsoft suggestions, right? And again, be aware, when we had this with the Horizon, VMware Horizon environment, which is essentially a VDI environment, that there are virtual machine escapes. Log4j was a real thing for this particular hypervisor. There are escapes that are known for other hypervisors as well. And so keep in mind that that is going to be layers below your computing environment, right? So again, you're really going to have to make sure that you're on top of that particular vulnerability management. Now, and here's where it gets really messy, is that the complexities of vulnerability management in VMware in general, or whatever hypervisor you choose, including Microsoft's hypervisor solutions, if that part of your infrastructure is in-house, that may have downtime associated with bringing that hypervisor layer up in terms of the patches and updates. Now, this is where the cloud environment may be the answer, because you can workload shift easily with a third-party vendor, like our host vendor. We can easily shift those workloads into the cloud, use and consume the hyper-converged environment, and then migrate those workloads back to your newly patched hypervisor environment. Now, this is becoming more and more of a problem, because what we've seen is a series of vulnerabilities, some at the layer of the firmware, some at the layer of the operating system, and some indeed at the layer of the hypervisor that your VDIs are going to be utilizing. So vulnerability management ends up being complex. And when I go back to Amazon or another provider like Azure, and you're using them for your workloads, chances are they are doing all of that work for you. So there is an argument that says get off your own tin that you're managing as much as possible and move to a cloud-based hypervisor environment, which then has your virtual desktop provisioning on top of that, okay? All right. Because the worst enemy of security is complexity. Bruce Schneier, right? We all love Bruce, right? But again, in those hybrid environments, in order to make it work, it becomes a very complex environment indeed. It becomes time-consuming to bring all of the parts together in native Windows or Azure, and this opens up the real discussion on where we end up next, which is end-user computing. So end-user computing is a theory. Well, I'm going to say it's theory right now. The vendor partners can get you there, but it's going to take a lot of work and effort. And really, end-user computing is about VDI and published applications, assuming that the application can run under any operating system, on any device, anywhere securely, and that the data is at least mapped or contained within the application itself, right? So we solve and get green checkmark boxes on the majority of our journey to zero trust, because we've gone out, we've bought tools to help us with all the things that we need to do, like microsegmentation, like identity, i.e. single sign-on MFA, to authenticate to the virtual environment. It's fantastic. The journey can begin with your endpoints, as I said, and your applications. Once you have everything in that hyper-converged environment, utilizing VDI technologies, you're now in a position to start looking at where your data is going to be and where it's going to be managed from. And you're now almost completely in control of your infrastructure, with the exception of things that may be mandatory provided to the business, such as, controls such as building management systems, BMSs, for instance, old infrastructure that's required of the business in an OT environment, right? Like take a print shop, for instance, where you're not gonna want to provide a Windows 2000 desktop environment to manage one or two devices within that environment. It's just not practical. And so you're now in a position where the majority of your infrastructure is under your management from tools that connect your hybrid environment to a cloud provision. And again, as you've now moved into that VDI promised land, end user computing with published apps that run on any platform, you almost have complete mastery over your networking architecture. In order to get here, though, you need to invest in a test lab, and you need to invest with a vendor that's going to see you through that journey. This could be, in a complex enterprise environment, a 3 to 4 to 5 year plan. And that includes finding a replacement for legacy applications that are currently prohibitive due to performance requirements or due to licensing requirements. Like anything with a dongle stuck in the back of it is not going to do particularly well in this environment. If you P2V it, you might need to invest in a lot of fancy software in order to keep that environment licensed. So when we think about end user computing as the next end state on the zero trust journey, there really has to be at the top of the list is the strategy, okay? And that strategy is something that you'll want to get good consultation and advice, maybe even implementation specialists to build your test lab in order to do it. There is a requirement to transform your desktop. Like I said, a lot of effort and work needs to go into your GPO architectures, your local security policies for this golden image or golden images that you're going to deploy to your folks in the VDI, but also then publishing the applications. Are you going to have enough resources to deliver those applications? Hopefully many of them are third-party web applications that are delivered where the majority of your end-user computing environment is already created for you, right? The delivery of those applications, including the vulnerability management piece of this, is an extraordinary effort that your team is going to have to do, and it's going to require coordination with all of the other vendors of your key business applications to make sure that they're going to be comfortable working in that VDI environment. Because even though you've migrated them to VDI, they may not scale or work appropriately on any operating system, any platform vision that you have until they're significantly updated. User experience and profile management. To this very day, these are the common concerns. So test before deployment. And in this particular environment, it's critical because we've seen it. There have been bad patches that come out that cause grief for the user. That is multiplied by potentially thousands of users in a VDI environment. So you have to be very careful, and this is why the protection of that environment is critical. The ability to look for anomalous behavior within the VDI environment is critical because you're going to need to get on top of a performance issue or a potential indication of compromise really quickly. Far faster than we currently, I think, are capable of moving. Secure access to that, to those hosts, and to the cloud. I can't tell you how many times where I've seen cloud infrastructure dumping all sorts of sensitive data into Azure blobs or S3. You want to find out what your level of exposure is, get yourself a cheap membership to Grey Hat Warfare, and start running your brands through Grey Hat Warfare, and you'll come to the conclusion that a lot of in hyper-converged environments and virtual desktops are still dumping anything from logs to sensitive data into unsecured S3 buckets. It doesn't necessarily take away from that architecture problem that we had at the main beginning, right, of this. Okay. And then, of course, the secure access to that environment is critical. It has to be protected, multi-factor authentication, secure web access gateways if you're dealing with super sensitive environments, and expectations of your users, right? Can't tell you how many times it's come down to DNS resolvers not working particularly properly from poorly implemented ISPs. that cause a whole pile of grief. And then I'm just going to sort of touch on this. This is super important when considering a VDI implementation of any sort, is call the vendors, understand first whether or not they support that particular journey that you want to go on. And the second thing is get test licensing or whatnot from those vendors in order to set up a lab. And be genuine about it. Like, say, listen, we're on a 3-month eval of this particular product. We have 10 applications that we want to test in your environment. Many companies will help you with that. I would encourage those vendors to all charge for a proof of concept period because the amount of effort to build even the test lab for a VDI or end user computing one day when you're on your journey environment becomes really important. In many IT teams have been very comfortable with the traditional IT environment. They are making that journey to cloud through digital transformation projects within their own environment. That digital transformation includes moving from a common kind of workstation to virtual desktop environments, then moving towards end user computing with public applications, relying on all sorts of different security models in order to protect the data within those applications, and in some cases, access controls through identity and access management solutions. So even though the VDI journey sort of starts and finishes at this all green checkbox environment, it does not necessarily mean from a security perspective that you get to put your feet up on the desk and not do much. There's still a ton of stuff that you've got to gear up for, including things like threat hunting within a virtual desktop environment, et cetera. So with that, I'm hoping that we talk in the Q&A here around the issues that I've brought up. If I don't know what I'm talking about, please tell me, because this was an educational journey for myself too. And, I kind of liken this experience to when somebody threw zero trust at me. I tried to drill into, well, what does that actually mean in practical terms? So a huge thank you to our sponsor for having me here. And I now await the IO storm of questions.
Okay. Great job, Ian. We do have some questions, and I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. Take advantage of a one-on-one with Ian, who probably charges $300 an hour for his consultations. So
I'm not a lawyer.
Let's get right to it. First question comes from Glenn. Is there any automation to reallocate resources between the individual sessions and the host resources, i.e. load balancing across the hardware based on current utilization of the environment?
I will say there absolutely is. And it's really interesting that you brought that up, because this is one of the huge challenges that we have in terms of preventing one user from consuming the entire virtual environment. Within the hypervisor controls, you certainly are able to load balance that. Within the performance, this is where you go to those third-party vendors that can migrate workloads, and not only can they migrate those workloads as virtual desktop environments, they also can, in real time, add the necessary resources. And this works very well in the cloud. I would say, though, put in budget controls on your cloud environment, or find a cloud provider where you sort of have, I'm going to put it in quotations, unlimited resources, because you'll find that even the thing like running Chrome in a VDI environment is going to consume a ton of memory. And you can't get away from it. Chrome with 10 tabs open, depending on what's going on, can be using at least half of your desktop resources. I see this on my Mac all the time when the thing starts hissing at me like some angry snake. So the same thing can happen within the actual environment. I would say, this is one of the key things where you put in to your proof of concept with your vendor in your test environment and run through those type of scenarios and say, okay, if this happens, what tools do I need? What thing do I press on the dashboard to enable a sort of a within limitations management of those particular resources at the client VDI level?
Okay, great. Next question reads, I've read that EDR can cause explosions and really poor performance in VDI environments. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so this was a case. It is the nature of EDR to look at all of the activity and look at, and extended EDR, especially into the network environment, where EDR is an active defense that is querying the types of processes that are running, looking for telltale signs of indications of compromise, and querying cloud-based support, if you will, for possibly even sandbox processing and other things like this. That takes a lot of cycles. And this is where, again, reaching out to that vendor of your particular EDR that you fancy and asking them about these kind of performance enhancements, because what I've noticed a lot now is folks have deployed EDR within your environment. They now are either looking at removing those licenses in favor of solutions that are delivered at the VDI layer of the organization. So, that might be a better approach depending on where you're at. But there's certainly going to be transition period where EDR. And then the other thing to say is that if you are using a workstation that has its own operating system and you're operating more inside a terminal server environment, if the environment of your remote desktop environment gets compromised, the EDR that's running on your workstation box may not even notice or see it, okay? Because, again, the suspicious activity may now be happening on a box that isn't yours. So, again, there's some careful considerations. And what you should be doing, in addition to that, of course, is taking those logs and sucking them into some sort of SIM solution so that you can look for anomalous behavior within that virtual environment, because things are happening rapidly. And although you get a bit of a performance boost from inter-process communication within the VDI environment, you still have possible network constraints, as all of these dozens, thousands, hundreds of sessions are all trying to get out to the same cloud to check, the IOCs that the EDR thinks it's found using its AI and behavior-based model. So there's a lot to this, and again, can't stress enough, this is your vendor's territory to help you out on, and of course, test before you just arbitrarily deploy it in a golden image.
Okay, nice. Next question comes from Tom in the audience. He says, Ian, can you please expand on your comment about using Windows and Azure for VDI? Is it not a good choice to use?
It is a good choice if you are in the business of being almost a total Microsoft shop. It does solve a number of your problems. The only issues that I have with Azure are you need a fat pipe on the client side in order to do it properly, and Azure can be massively expensive as well. One of the reasons why those hybrid environments are really are really interesting is because you can use your own PIN, you can use your own networking infrastructure for those users that have maybe peaks. So as an example, you've got a sales team that's out there, and the only time the sales application gets hit heavily is when you're generating your monthly reports, right? And what you can do with tools, especially the one that we have our vendors, is you can put those users at that particular time into a cloud environment and then pull them back to your own PIN. So if you've tuned it for your own on-premise stuff and you still want to maximize the value of that particular hardware, during peak seasons, if you will, of your organization, like year-end, for instance, when you know the accounting team is going to be hammering data, you can balance to the business. And that optimizes the performance of that end-user computing environment. And this is almost at the level of art now, as opposed to what we used to have, which was kind of like putting the finger up and seeing which way the wind is blowing in terms of the network performance. The visibility that these tools give you is fantastic. And Azure is a great solution, but it's an expensive solution if you're not considering using what infrastructure you already have invested in.
Okay, well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Ian, for a great presentation and answering those questions.
You're welcome.